Thank you very much, Mr. Richard Trevor, Partner Global Head of Infrastructure, Global Head of KPMG Impact and KPMG International, for your insightful presentation. So I would like to make a quick reminder for everybody who's joining in. We will be taking your questions at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, please forward your question to our Zoom chat. It's time for us to move on to the next presentation. So I would like to invite our second speaker to do the honors, Professor Sirimal Abeyratne. Professor Sirimal Abeyratne is a professor of economics from the University of Colombo. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Colombo, a master's degree from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and a PhD from the Free University of Amsterdam. I would now like to invite Professor Sirimal Abeyratne to do the honors, your presentation on imperatives for sustainable economic development. Over to you now.
Also, I want to thank you, all of the office bearers, including the President-elect of the Organization for Professional Association, for giving me this opportunity to share my views on the sustainability aspects of economic growth and development. Richard focus on is basically conceptual and international side of the presentation, also touching upon the opportunities that Sri Lanka has. He mentioned about ESG opportunities that are available for Sri Lanka. By the way, I'm trying to confine myself to less than half an hour given the time constraint. ESG, environment, society and governance, a new concept that has emerged in our attempt to look for the new economic orders. I hope it is independently that there is another conceptual framework that has emerged, I think in the 80s or 90s, that is called TBL. TBL, triple bottom line. The TBL and ESG, there is a great deal of overlapping. Triple bottom line is achieving economic benefits while maintaining a balance with environment and society, good outcome in these particular two areas. So we have, it's also called triple P because we are concerned, we are looking at 3 P's: planet, that is environment; people, that is society; and profits, that is economics. So that's called triple bottom line. And if you look around, the world is moving in this direction. And if you are an exporter to the advanced country markets, European Union, and greening the industry is a big slogan today, so that there are environmental and certain social standards that they have to meet in order to be eligible to have access to those markets. So that's a new order of economic development, given the so much challenges with respect to environment, with respect to climate change, with respect to carbon emission, and with respect to all these things, it's a new economic order that has been highlighted in the world. I will come back to that point later. But why it is relevant in our subject called economics, I'm actually going to focus a little more about Sri Lanka. After this, some of these concepts that I want to explain in very simple language. Why it is important in economics terms? Because economics is always, and it is about creating value, adding value. So you take what is given here by nature, by God, and all these things that are available, and then you add value to it. You keep adding value and creating more and more value. That is economics. And in modern terms, economic progress and our wealth and prosperity and well-being, all these things, to which extent, to how far we are moving ahead, all these things depends on the way that we add value, the way that we create value. So creating value is all about economics. Now, how to create this value? If you have done some economics at very basic level, you know that there are certain factors of production. We call them productive factors, and that is conventionally in our textbooks we read it as labor, capital, land. Also you can include entrepreneurship, but the first basic thing is labor, capital, land. Very narrow definition. And we all understand labor, we all understand capital, but we have reduced so much that we are concerning with environment into one particular simple term called land. If you put it in another way, and country can go and have this value creation, what we are having is actually what we deserve for that. We have a given capacity to add value. And so that if you want to add more value, you have to expand that capacity also. And this capacity is given by the number of stocks that you have in terms of all these productive factors, the amount of stocks that you are maintaining. Capital is the amount of the stock of productive factor, which is called capital, financial capital you can term it, or machinery and equipment and all man-made assets you can put it there, and that is capital. And we have a stock of capital for a country until unless you expand it further. You have a stock, given stock of labor for a country, and that stock can also expand in terms of number of heads, so in terms of the capabilities of people through education, training and professional experience. So there's a stock of labor. There's a stock of technology, which is called knowledge. There's a stock of knowledge available to a country, and that is called technology. And what kind of knowledge we are talking about here? The way that we should create value, or in other words, the way that we transform inputs into output. Inputs into output. The way that we convert inputs into output, that is called technology, and is also stock of knowledge. Stock of knowledge. If you look at all around here, you will see a lot of artifacts, environmental facts, organizational arrangements, and all these things to put certain inputs and to create something new. Even in this conference, this seminar, you will see all these arrangements. That is the technology, knowledge required to create something new. Last thing, which is very much relevant to our topic here now, land, but we can call it the stock of natural resources. stock of natural resources. In fact, even in economics, this factor we did not talk that much about that factor until recently, and we understood the danger of environmental degradation and the danger of climate change and the danger of unbearable emission of CO2, carbon emission, and so now it is very much recognized in all kinds of economic activity. There is a negative impact, or rather we are making use of that natural stock of natural capital which is available to us. A stock of natural capital which is available to us. This is very important, and I don't think Sri Lanka is ignorant about it, and our producers are ignorant about it, particularly the large-scale producers. They all know about it, and I will also list out the steps that we have taken over the last couple of years. But before that, Sri Lanka has always been in the front line in being part of all these international movements, the so-called conventions, international conventions, international protocols, international agreements, international treaties, in all these things. In fact, if I give you a number, after 1950, during the second half of the 20th century, 50 years, within that period, Sri Lanka has been a signatory for over 40 international movements. It's a remarkable achievement for developing country as such. Remarkable. Over 40 international conventions, agreements, protocols and treaties on environment. Not in any other area, on environment related movements. That's a great thing, but we also have to honor those agreements, and we can sign the agreements and come back and then start cutting down now for us, and you can't have double game here. If you have been a signatory, we have been so, and then we have to honor those agreements also. But I am happy that Sri Lanka has been there. But the dangerous point is actually Sri Lanka has been categorized as one of the hotspots in the world. Hotspot. What do we mean by hotspot? We call it biodiversity hotspot to make it a little more understandable. Hotspot is, in fact, not the whole world, whole planet is a hotspot. There are certain locations on Earth which are called hotspot. Hotspot, to become a hotspot, there are two kinds of criteria. If you do a Google search, you will find out more detail and more writings about this and where these concepts emerge and all these things. But let me give you the brief outline of these two factors. Number one, endemic species. That location should have more than 1,500 endemic species. Number one criteria. Number two criteria, by this time, that location should have lost more than 70% of habitat for that endemic species. So first one is a good one, positive criteria, and second one is a negative criteria. If you could satisfy both, Sri Lanka satisfies both. So Sri Lanka is considered to be one of the hotspots in the world. It shows, on the other hand, the rich diversity that we are having in terms of our natural resources, but also it shows that how what kind of danger that the country is in. So we should be focusing more on this area, which is actually an international requirement today, not because we have signed those agreements and not because we can't sell that in the European Union markets or in the USA, but because we also want it. That's why that TBL, triple bottom line concept, talk about balancing these three areas: profits, people, planet. In other words, environment, society, and economy. Three aspects have to be balanced. In fact, the corporate world is also now moving in that direction. Now, let me also talk about poverty. Poverty. And poverty also and development, we have been talking about all these things since the time that I started to learn economics and through my A levels and until today. And I'm referring to Sri Lanka as a developing country. As a developing country. Even my teachers, when they started teaching me at that time, they also call it a developing country. And today we teach our students, and Sri Lanka is a developing country. It's a miracle to keep a country developing all the time. Poverty is a characteristic of this development, this underdevelopment. Now let me give you some statistics to understand this point. Now, somehow we managed to, after 70 years, we managed to come to lower middle income status. So now we are at the lower middle income status. I am sure very soon we are going to move on to the upper middle income status also, because after we make our GDP and income adjusted for the port city contribution, suddenly we will jump into the upper middle income also, and it has not yet been adjusted. So, according to our level of economic income level, the appropriate poverty line is middle income poverty line, lower middle income poverty line, which is actually, if I convert it into rupees, 600 rupees a day. 600 rupees a day. So there are people, over 2 million people live in this country earning less than 600 rupees a day. Over 2 million people. If you take the upper middle income poverty line, that is about 1,000 rupees a month, there are actually 40% of our people remain poor, which means the number of people earning less than 1,000 rupees a day. And if you also analyze, go a little deeper in this area, you will find over 90% of our poor live in the rural sector. Over 90% of our people live in the rural sector. So the rural sector, we know that the dominant economic activity is agriculture. Rural sector and poverty, these two concepts, they have much more things to share. The majority of our poor live in the rural sector. If you look at Sri Lankan demographic status, and by about 1950, that means mid-20th century, 1950, by the time we receive independence, that is 1948, around that time, our total population in this country was 7 million. And today, how many? We have over 21 million. So, which means now, within this 70-year period, and our population has tripled.
And they have tripled, and with this population growth, what has happened? Where do they live? They scattered all over the country, and they move into even deep jungles, and then clearing our forest, and so they found their habitat scattered all over the country. That's why we have this human-elephant conflict today, because the people and elephants, they are fighting for their land, ancestral land. But this is, I'm going to tell you something very controversial. This is anti-development, this kind of development. If you look population density statistics in the world, Sri Lanka is also not a country with abundant land. Sri Lanka is a land scarce country. So what should happen? Over time, along with development, people should get concentrated into urban and semi-urban locations. They should get concentrated and leaving smaller number of people in the rural areas. That should have happened. In all other developed countries, if you look at the development history, even in Asia, it is happening. One interesting country is China, which has also understood that their population, urban-rural demographic composition is not consistent with the level of development that they want to achieve. If you again search for the term called New Urbanization Plan in China, something like that, I am not sure exactly it is the title, but New Urbanization Plan. You will see Chinese government, I think it started in 2014, to move 250 million people from the rural sector to the urban sector. And in this country, if you are thinking of something like that, you will do the other way around, moving city people to the rural sector. But why China is doing such a controversial urbanization plan? To move farmers, 250 million farmers, from rural sector to urban sector? Because it is anti-development, the way that it has been there. They want to make the development faster. Why it is anti-development? Because if you keep people there, scattered and letting them to grow vegetables and paddy in small plots of land, and they will never come out of that poverty. They will not come out of that poverty. I made the comparison between Sri Lanka and the Netherlands, because I am also a little familiar with Netherlands, and as he said, my postgraduate studies are from the Netherlands. A small country, and we both countries have the same number of labor force, 9 million people. Out of that 9 million in the Netherlands, and Netherlands people's only 200,000 are farmers. But Netherlands is a country which exports a lot of agriculture commodities, dairy products, meat products, potato, flowers, and vegetables and fruits. Only 200,000 rich farmers, and farmers are richer than professors and doctors and engineers and all kinds of professionals. The farmers are richer than all of them. Why? Because there are only 200,000 farmers, and each farmer has about 25,000, average farm size in the Netherlands is 25,000 hectares. What is the average farm size in Sri Lanka? 1 acre. So our basic problem is, that's why we keep people poor in the rural sector. The basic problem is too many people. How many farmers do we have in our country? 2.2 million farmers. Out of that 9 million workforce, more than 2 million are still in the agriculture sector. Almost about a quarter of our labor force got stuck in the agriculture sector. So they remain poor. And this has something harmful for the environment also. Why is that? I mentioned one important factor, because they scattered everywhere into the deep jungles, clearing the jungles, and then damaging our environment, and then threatening our wildlife, and all these things are part of that. In addition, there are research done in the world, I have seen those research, agrochemicals. The smaller farmers used more and more agrochemicals in the world. What is the reason? The reason is their productivity is very low because their farm size is too small for a family to survive, so that they are helpless to go beyond that point, so that they keep pouring out agrochemicals to maximize their output. Agrochemicals. So that's why in Sri Lanka, our agriculture commodities, they come to the market with so much agrochemicals, and it not only keep the farmers poor, and also it keeps the population sick and unhealthy, and because they have to eat agrochemicals, poisonous food. Sri Lanka, in another 5 minutes I will wind up. Sri Lanka has been moving ahead. Why is that? I am going to quote a number of cases that I was also involved in some of these things. Partly because some of our large companies are actually, because they are connected to the Western markets, and so that they know the importance of all these environmental factors. So if you want, I can also list out those names, the companies, and if you take their products, you will find a lot of environmental attributes in those things. Carbon neutral underwears and carbon neutral tea, and so which means actually there are various things. In any kind of economic activity, you emit carbon. Even in this room, this activity that we are taking place, we emit carbon, and in the present world, and the world, they know they have the technology to calculate how much carbon monoxide that we have emitted when we finish this activity here. So we all are engaged in this, but you can make it neutral by compensating it. That's what means carbon neutral. And there's a huge demand out there for that kind of products. Eco-labels. Eco-label is a very popular thing, and most of our 5-star hotels and all these things, and they have these eco-labels, and certain products are coming with eco-labels. And the Tourism Development Authority has taken steps, and I was also involved in that activity, because international eco-labels are expensive ones, so that bringing the all kinds of tourism industry into a national sustainable activity. They started in 2018 to provide national sustainable standards for accommodation sector. And so that third party is coming to evaluate environmental standards, and then they issue certificate, they can claim higher premium. So a lot of products are coming out. Our commercial banks, and on their own, they have stepped in to provide something called green financing. And then the central bank also, I was involved in that also, took that initiative to provide green financing. If you are submitting a business proposal to a bank, commercial bank, to get business loan, and if all those sustainable elements are incorporated into that, then you are entitled for green financing. And then we are actually moving, but it's not enough, because our structural problems that we mentioned, which are related to poverty and environment, they still very much we preserve them without addressing those fundamental issues. We are taking a lot of things on the surface, but without addressing the problems at source. Current crisis, my last point that I want to highlight. Current crisis, and we all know the pandemic issue has pandemic problem. It has hit the economy, but the current issue is not related to pandemic problem. It's a pre-pandemic problem. Pandemic has hit the economy after that. So today we are looking for short-term solutions for a long-term problem which is not going to work. Because short-term solutions take us back to the beginning of our pandemic economy. And if you look at the number of years before the pandemic, you will see our economy has been sliding down continuously. Why it has been sliding down over the last 10 years or 20 years, I can go back to 20 years, because we didn't find two important solutions for the sustainable economic growth. Number one, investment. Our investment climate is very weak, and we have not generated enough investment. Number two, our export growth. Our export growth is very minimal, sluggish, so compared to many other countries in the neighborhood, so that we keep sliding down because of these problems when the economy was hit by the COVID pandemic, which actually became a knockout punch. We have to begin from that point. Short-term solutions are necessary because of this short-term problem, but much more than that, the fundamental issues have to be addressed at their source to sustain the economy while balancing people and the planet, these two elements. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sirimal Abeyratne, for that insightful presentation on what it looks like here locally. And we have a few questions as well. So our first speaker will also join in answering the Q&A session. So we have Mr. Richard Threlfall, who spoke on imperatives for sustainable economic development. So my first question would be to Mr. Richard. Do we have Mr. Richard online? Mr. Richard, the first question would be, in your opinion, what are those quick wins you would suggest that Sri Lanka could adopt on ESG?
Well, thank you for that. I mean, firstly, I think Sri Lanka, along with a number of other countries that I mentioned before, has actually made some really great progress. Not just in the last year, but indeed in recent weeks. So I think the commitment that has been made not to build any more coal-fired power stations is absolutely critical. The actually quite ambitious commitments around renewable generation are hugely welcome. And if you look across other countries, the quick wins, as you described them, have nearly all been in the energy generation space, because the technology is mature, the price, as I indicated in one of my slides, the price of renewable technologies has plummeted over the last 10 years to the point at which it is definitively cheaper in the long run to build renewable power today than it is to build extractives-based power sources. So from an investment point of view, picking up Professor Sirimal's closing point around the lack of future investment, the quick win, the obvious place for an economy like Sri Lanka to go is to make sure that the investments that you're putting in place today are ones that sit within the space of the green economy. So that is undoubtedly the place I would go first. The second area that I would pick up reflects the comments that Professor Sirimal made around the reliance of the Sri Lankan economy so significantly still on the agricultural sector, and the relationship that you have in terms of how do you drive both economic growth on the one hand, and how do you do that on a way that is green and sustainable, and how do you do that in a way that protects your natural environment. Again, as Professor Sirimal referenced, part of the problem is that we've been relentlessly pursuing across the world for the last at least 100 years this pursuit of agricultural productivity, which often comes at the cost of the diminishing in the long run the sustainability of the land. And I think if there was a policy which is going to be the most critical, it would be effectively a rural-based economic policy that creates pathways for individuals working within rural economies to become part of effectively the digital knowledge economy. Like so many other island nations, the potential in Sri Lanka today, because of the digital connectivity, indeed the digital connectivity which is allowing me to join your conversation in Colombo today, this is revolutionary. It's revolutionary in developed economies in terms of the ability to allow those that live within rural areas to become part of the knowledge economy and to become more productive. But it's arguably even more critical, I would say, for island economies, because of the way that individuals can integrate into anything around the global knowledge space. So those would be my top two picks.
We have another question on the same note. So do you think ESG compliance is something that countries should implement by way of forcing through compliance requirement and penal provisions, or voluntarily adopt it?
Well, I think we would all hope and want that businesses would voluntarily adopt in the first instance, and we have seen over the last year or two the world's leading companies voluntarily adopting ever higher levels of disclosure, and doing so for the sorts of reasons that I referenced in my presentation. They're doing so because they can see that it's fundamentally important to their reputations. They're doing it in some cases because the senior leadership genuinely believe that it is the right thing to do, and they're doing it because they recognise that it's ultimately in their economic interest as businesses. Those businesses that do not voluntarily disclose will find themselves required to by regulation before 2030. I guarantee it, across the world. So there's a strong argument in any case that you might as well start to prepare for that disclosure now, because it will come, and it would be better that you weren't put in a position where you were caught out as a business and not able to respond quickly enough.
Thank you very much, Mr. Richard. And I would also like to ask if Professor Sirimal has anything to comment on ESG to begin with.
Yeah, I think the question is whether it has to be voluntary or enforced. I think as the way that the world is moving, and we have seen both sides, because when the national governments are adopting rules and regulations, and when they have become the signatories of the international conventions, then I think it has become a requirement for those countries to adhere to the specifications and standards that are being set out by those international conventions and agreements. Apart from that, and then private sector can also initiate those things voluntarily, and we have a number of examples in this country. In fact, green financing was initiated by the private banks in this country, and they step out taking this initiative, and only after that the central bank actually prepared the guidelines for green financing as well. And in addition, then there are other environmentally related aspects coming under CSR responsibility. So as a way that they want to present the products to the world, as I mentioned, carbon neutral or under eco labels, or even buying biodiversity credit, something called. There are various financing mechanisms have evolved, and private sector has stepped into these things, because it also, environment is today not necessarily something outside the business, and it has become a part of the core business. So in that sense, I think the many companies are in the world moving in this direction, and a couple of companies in Sri Lanka also moving in this direction voluntarily. And that voluntary movement has also can be facilitated with the greater commitment and responsibilities undertaken by the authorities as well. That's my thinking.
Professor, we have a few more questions. Do you think Sri Lanka has any hope of coming out of the current economic situation?
Yes, Sri Lanka can, but my answer is twofold actually. The first part is Sri Lanka can come out, obviously naturally, because now if you look at the global situation, I think close to 6 billion people have already been vaccinated all around the world. And we have seen the signs of, as a side effect of that vaccine program, we have seen the rising aggregate demand, and pressure is on rising international prices on particularly fuel and food prices. So these are signs of economic recovery in the world. And Sri Lanka is also one of the developing countries which has implemented the vaccination program successfully. In fact, our vaccination program is quite ahead of many other developing countries, and already 50% of our population have been given both doses. So which means actually Sri Lanka is moving faster than many other developing countries. Well, you can look at many other weak areas inside the program, but as a number, for comparison, Sri Lanka has been doing well. With that, we can open the economy. I don't know whether there are other different waves coming in. I am not an expert to answer in that respect, but if this is the downturn of the pandemic situation, obviously Sri Lankan economy is coming back to the normal situation, so that some of the current issues that we are having at the moment, such as import controls and exchange rate problems and all these things, I think the government is also keeping so much hope on tourism, and tourism is an area where which has contributed about $5 billion earnings every year. So that is the immediate response that we can think of, so that coming back to the normalcy or the recovery is not far from today. But my second part of the question is, as I have spoken in that area in my speech, recovery does not mean that Sri Lanka will be doing better, because we are coming back to the pre-pandemic economic situation. Means we are back in that slower economic progress. That episode is not Sri Lanka's potential for the future. In fact, Sri Lanka has to go beyond the recovery. If Sri Lanka has to go beyond recovery, as I mentioned, short-term solutions for a long-term problem won't be enough. We need to address the fundamental problems at their source.
Well, since you mentioned about short-term and long-term solutions, your next question, the question we've received, is on short-term solutions and long-term solutions. So let me move on to the next question. How do you propose we strike a balance between short-term and long-term solutions?
Well, short-term solutions means actually the current economic crisis, which there are a couple of elements in this area. One is import control, other one is the shortage of foreign exchange, other one is bunching up foreign debt, and another one is the inability of the government to finance its typical spending that the government did before the pandemic situation. So all these things were interrelated problems, and that has been aggravated by the pandemic situation. The short-term solution would be our major problem with the dollar shortage. As the government is doing, there is no miracle that we can expect to have dollars by tomorrow, and the central bank cannot print dollars also in the backyard. Central bank can print rupees, but not the dollars. The dollars have to be earned. And earning is a long-term thing. So that's why I said that there should be a long-term solution. But if you look at it short-term, anyway, the economy has to hang on to whatever the avenues available to maintain the current dollar shortage, which means that's why the authorities are actually looking at various sources to borrow dollars and to get into swap agreements, and also the authorities have rejected certain things. Those are political issues. But anyway, so those are the things. The second area is actually investing in asset. Somebody can say selling the asset, somebody can say investing in asset. Depending on the way that you want to convey that message to public, you can speak whether it is selling or whether it is investing. That's a different matter. So those are the short-term solutions until we manage this crisis, just to keep our nose above the water. And then going until we come back to normalcy and we generate our remittances and tourism earnings. But going beyond that point is the problem, and that is the main issue to my understanding, where we need to address two basic issues. That is the second part of the answer. Two basic issues. What are the two basic issues? Why our economy has come to this level? Because number one, our export growth is very minimal over the last 20-30 years, export growth. If I put it in a perspective, in 1990, 30 years ago, we have been exporting $2 billion worth exports. And Vietnam has also exporting $2 billion worth exports. Vietnam and we were together at the same level. 30 years later, today, I'm talking about last year export figures, we have exported 10 billion worth exports, and Vietnam exported 280 billion exports. So you can imagine the gap between the two countries, our export growth. And why export growth is so low? Because there is no investment. And then you look at what is the problem of investment. And investment, if you look at good old days, and the world, all over the world, they had an idea that we should save more, and then we can invest more, and then we can grow. So countries have done that, but it is not a requirement today, because you don't have to save, and in fact, developing countries cannot save that much because their income levels are lower. But it's not a problem today, because the world has saved a lot of money. And billions and trillions of dollars are accumulated in all financial centers in the world, seeking better locations for investment. And they are moving into some locations in billions, about 150 billion to 200 billion to China, about 100 billion, close to 90 billion to Singapore, even about 50 billion to India, our neighboring country, and about less than 1 billion to Sri Lanka. So you should ask the question, why on earth this greatest country in the world, which we call since our childhood, and why investors don't want to trust to put their money here?
Thank you very much.
That is the long-term solution.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I would like to invite the President-elect of the OPA and Chairman of the 34th Annual Conference, Mr. Dulitha Perera, to present tokens of appreciations to our speakers. We will be now presenting a token of appreciation to Professor Sirimal Abeyratne. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this session, which was on imperatives for sustainable economic development.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much once again. And we had Mr. Richard Threlfall, Partner Global Head of Infrastructure, Global Head of KPMG Impact and KPMG International, joining us virtually. We do have your token of appreciation. Thank you so much for joining despite your busy schedule. So this will be delivered to you in due course. Thank you very much to our speakers once again, and thank you very much to the President-elect, Mr. Dulitha Perera, as well. We now break for lunch, and we will be coming back at 1:30 for the next breakout session, which is on legal and regulatory reforms for business and economic development. See you soon.